So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my day job at Catalyx, but mainly this presentation is going to be full of rather dodgy segues, some rather silly pictures, and a few stories. We're talking about when crowds don't know that they are crowds and why this can be even more powerful. I think you'll agree with me, probably the catchiest title of the day so far. Yes, but I think what's really important about this presentation, and what we've heard a lot about before, is when crowds come together as communities and do things at scale. What we're starting to touch on, what the last presentation talked about, what the presentation on collective intelligence talked about, is actually crowds can be even more powerful when you're just using them and their data when they're not actually being motivated to come together to solve tasks at scale. So first of all, let me start our day job at Catalyx. We are a crowdsourcing agency. We basically use crowdsourcing and their data to solve interesting business challenges, hopefully in new ways to come up with better solutions to generally marketing and innovation challenges. We work with people like Procter & Gamble, with the Red Cross, with Medtronic, and people like Chiquita, and all sorts of people like that. So I wanted to start off with asking you two questions. Who here has a washing machine? Who here has ever eaten sweet potatoes? Who here has ever washed their sweet potatoes in their washing machine? I thought so. However, in China, a rather smart consumer electronics company started listening into their customer services in a much more creative way than most companies do on the planet. And they heard that lots of people's washing machines were getting blocked. Now, no one really said why, but they started to investigate this. And they found that Chinese consumers do wash sweet potatoes in their washing machine. And indeed, a lot of other vegetables and that kind of stuff. And they started off exploring this and realized that the scale of this was enormous. So they created a washing machine, like you see here, that can wash sweet potatoes in it. And they sold 10,000 of these units in the first week. Now, what's interesting about that is individual people calling up to complain that their washing machine was useless, didn't work, whatever. And all they did was they joined the dots. And I love the gaping void visual that Rob showed earlier, because I actually think that most people use crowdsourcing at an infinitesimal amount of how it can be used. So if you start joining those dots of social media, of customer services, of geolocated tweets, you can actually find some incredibly powerful stories, insights, and use the crowd for some very good ways. So I challenge myself in this presentation to talk about basically that there should be no interaction between the crowd, that there should be no traditional style research, polls and questions, no observer effect, that kind of thing, and that it should be about thousands or ideally hundreds of thousands of unrelated individual actions creating creative solutions, quite often in unrelated categories. Why is that really powerful? It's powerful because it's real. So the trouble with asking someone to do something is that you change the way that they think. We saw it earlier, the Daniel Kahneman thinking fast and slow. The minute you put a microphone in front of someone, the minute you ask someone to do a task, you jolt them out from their daily lives. You make them think in a different way, use the back of their brain instead of the front of their brain, and you get what in the research industry we call the observer effect. Suddenly, with the emergence of crowdsourcing, with the emergence of social media, and with new technologies, that goes away at a massive scale. So instead of ethnographic research being about sitting in a consumer's home quietly in the background or watching how people shop, you're suddenly looking at that with hundreds and thousands and millions of people. It's passive, so again, there's no effect, and it's massive. So these three things combined can do some really, really important things. So along with talking about washing machines and sweet potatoes, I wanted to tell you 6 more stories, really. Some of the stuff that we've done and some of the stuff that I just find really fascinating, hopefully to inspire you, or at least have a good story to tell this evening over a beer. So, as I said, I'm apologising about my dodgy segues. We're going to go from washing vegetables to beards. I love this story because this was a brand came to us, a famous consumer electronic shaving brand, came to us and they said, we've got a problem. And they said, our problem is we've run out of questions. And the reason, and so doing any form of research or understanding or working with our consumers or working with our R&D people is not going to work because we've run out of questions. What do they mean by that? They meant that they were asking the same questions to the same people all the time. They were going and observing and doing surveys and doing research and all the usual stuff, and they were asking people, basically, how do you shave? And most guys, primarily who they were talking to, said, really? You're an electronic shaving company. You don't need to ask us that question. And honestly, I get up at 6 in the morning, I'm really bleary-eyed, and I just kind of shave. So their innovation was massively being affected by that because they were going, well, we need to make this more convenient, we need to make this more comfortable, we need to put a button on the razor, we need to make the razor more waterproof. And very, very functional stuff. So we said, well, let's stop asking any questions at all. Let's just go and find out what people are talking about when it comes to beards and when it comes to removal of beards, so shaving, in real life, online. We looked in Japan and we looked in America to understand when that conversation manifests itself, what's the cultural differences, what were the wider context of that conversation. And lo and behold, we suddenly found that this was a really, really, really interesting subject. Because if you're a man, this is about the only thing you can do to define yourself, because we generally don't wear makeup, we generally don't wear jewelry. So actually, although I think guys won't really admit it, it's really important to guys. Shall I shave? Shall I grow 3-day stubble? What should I do? Suddenly that conversation becomes really interesting. So a really small example is there was something in Japan called the holiday beard. And this was an actual thing. Japan's a very conservative culture, I'd say, and when you go to work, you're expected to be clean shaven. So the holiday beard equals escape. For those 2 weeks, I can go off and be myself, really be myself. And for a brand, that kind of insight's really interesting, because suddenly I'm not talking about the extra button on my razor, I'm talking about how I can integrate into that emotional journey of escaping from work to be on holiday, or about coming back from that holiday and going back into your working life, which suddenly completely changes the context. So from beards to gender in banks. I think it's well known that the banking industry is male-dominated. I think the fact is, I think it's about 70% male, 30% female. And banks worry about this. They worry about it an awful lot, actually. Because they don't want it to be that way. And particularly HR departments in banks who are looking at recruitment are tasked with trying to get more women interested in banking. And however, they're tackling this problem in a really bad way. I'll give you a horrible example. I won't name the culprit because it will do them a disservice. But for instance, one bank decided that the best way of getting more females into their bank was just to make all their recruitment material pink. So I can almost feel the room get a bit more angry. And just horrible stuff like this. So they said, what are we doing wrong? How can we find out about this? They first of all said, are we as an industry discriminatory? Do women not want to come to us for reasons because it's male dominated, because it's an aggressive culture, because there are films like Wolf of Wall Street out there? And help us find out, and then help us find the problem. So again, we went out to the crowd to try and understand the conversations that crowds are having, particularly new recruits, about coming into banking. And what we found was counterintuitive to everything that they thought was happening. So what we found was a really embracing culture, was places on things like Student Room where people were actively encouraging women to come into banking, and guys were saying, oh, we'd love you in there, and new employees were coming in and saying, just very positive language and so on. We dug a little deeper, And the long and the short of it was what we actually found was that banks are discriminatory because they only ask for people to come from mainly scientific subjects. It's got nothing to do with the bank. At the age of 16, if you look at the number of, in England, for instance, when we do A-levels, the number of women that move into chemistry and maths and engineering is, lo and behold, around 70-30. And they're the subjects that banks recruit from. So suddenly that completely changes the goalposts of that conversation, because you're suddenly looking to talk not just now at the age of 21 when you're trying to get graduates into the bank, but working with schools and the government and students themselves to say, well, either these subjects are interesting, regardless of your gender, or let's start recruiting from a wider group of subjects and then create programs so that people can come up to the same level that needs to be in terms of expertise and knowledge to be able to work effectively in a bank. Who knows about reCAPTCHA? I would imagine most people in the room. So I won't go too far, but what a wonderful idea this is. How many people get frustrated with putting passwords into stuff online? How many people, even though you're not allowed to, have a list hidden somewhere on their computer because you've got 45 different passwords for different things with multiple, special characters and big letters, and you've no idea what's going on? So what did reCAPTCHA say? Well, let's make this process useful. Does everyone know that basically when you're putting these words into reCAPTCHA, what you're actually doing is translating all the books in the world to make electronic copies of books? And now that's moved into Google because Google own it, so it's now about trying to make street signs and road numbers and house numbers and place names electronic so that Google Maps will get better. So all you think you're doing is trying to go through your usual security, and what reCAPTCHA is doing, of course, is making the world a better place. It's just such a wonderful example of using a crowd in a positive way without the crowd necessarily knowing that they're working together to solve a big problem. Who here has one of these, or an equivalent, a Fitbit, a Garmin, a Jawbone? If someone's brave enough, did you buy it for yourself? You put your hand up. Did you buy it for yourself to track your own behavior, perhaps to understand your sleep, or what was your reason for buying?
No, it was part of a challenge, so for work-life.
Okay.
So I didn't buy it for myself, it was bought for me.
But now you wear it, right? I get. Did you ever think about when you bought it that if it's, for instance, a Jawbone, that they're looking at sleep data and working with the US National Institute of Health to understand how they can make the US a much more healthy place to try and get people to sleep better and longer, because suddenly they've got enough people creating this on a daily basis to be able to create essentially a national census of sleep, for instance. So why do we do this for a work challenge? We do this because we want to be healthier. We do this, we want to track how we eat. What we don't realize is that what's going on in the background is that actually this can make the world a better place. Now, it's no surprise that Vitality, what used to be called Prudential, has started handing these out. Because as an insurance company, they quite like that data. But also, if you're not a cynic about that, what they realize is they can make insurance what's become from what was a very negative thing to what's actually a really positive thing. You get free gym vouchers and free Sainsbury's vouchers if you have one of these, and if you do certain challenges. And what they're really interested in is, of course, all the data that's coming out from that. So another great example of, you think that this is for you or a challenge or whatever, but actually it's at an enormous scale that this crowdsourced data is really solving some very, very big problems. Larry Page's vocal cords. Larry Page, founder of Google. You know he talks funny? He's got quite a high-pitched voice. He's got a very rare disease that affects his vocal cords, and obviously that means he's been in and out of hospital for ages, and because he happens to be the co-founder of Google and likes to organize the world's data, he got thinking, and suddenly you think, well, if you can anonymize all the world's medical records and then start to understand the data from those medical records, you can suddenly start to solve big medical problems. You can suddenly start to join the dots on ultra-rare diseases, of which 2 or 3 may be happening in any country at any one time, to come up with faster solutions to solve medical issues. And the final story I want to tell you about is this. So this is London, but not as we know it. This is a correlation between noise, pollution, and emotion in London. So town planning is all about essentially trying to make cities work better. But actually, how do we all feel about a city? I think that's what you really care about. Am I having fun? Oh, this noise is irritating me. Or everything about a city and how you live is emotional. So what they've done is take geolocalized Instagram and Twitter messages that have emotions put into them at a massive scale to be able to map out the emotion within a particular space within a city linked to the noise that is happening within that city, which suddenly flips the idea of urban planning over completely and starts to make you really think, well, how do I make this city a better place? This is an open data project called Chatty Maps. They're now looking at all sorts of other different ways. They're looking at other different cities, New York, for instance. I urge you to go and have a look at it. You may bury yourself in this for 2 or 3 hours. It's just fascinating you'll certainly go and look up what your street is like and contribute. So that's all I wanted to say, other than to say the floodgates are really opening. I think we're only just getting started. It's really great to see so many people in this room so interested in this subject. The pace of change within crowdsourcing, big data, gamification really is fast, and let's hope that we keep moving, and this time next year we've got even more great case studies. So thank you very much.